The smell hit him before the sound did. Sharp smoke, hot metal, and something else underneath it. Something that made every hair on his back rise before his mind even understood why. Kale froze at the edge of the tall grass, one paw lifted mid-step, his ears turning like small satellites toward the ridge above the valley. Something was wrong. The birds had stopped calling, the wind had gone still, and in that silence, a young wolf who had never known real danger felt his heart begin to pound in a way it never had before. He was only a few months past his first winter, still more legs than muscle, still clumsy when he ran through thick brush. His mother, Freya, stood a few feet ahead of him, her body low, her golden eyes locked on the tree line. She did not move. She did not blink. And that, more than anything, told Kale that whatever was coming was not something to play with.
Behind Kale, his two littermates, Bram and Ivy, pressed close together, their small bodies trembling.
They had grown up in a den tucked beneath an old fallen pine, in a forest that stretched for miles in every direction. A forest that had always felt endless, always felt safe. Their world was simple. Wake, hunt, play, sleep, and listen to their mother's stories about the mountains beyond the valley, where their pack had lived for generations. But lately, the forest had started to feel smaller. It began months earlier, though Kale had been too young to understand it at the time. Strange new sounds echoed across the valley, low growls that were not animal, sharp cracks that were not thunder. Every few weeks, a new patch of trees disappeared, as if some invisible force were slowly eating the forest from the edges inward. Freya had explained it to her pups one evening, her voice careful, measured, trying not to frighten them. "There are creatures on two legs," she had said. "They are clever, and they are many. They do not hunt like us. They change the land itself." Kale had not understood what that meant, not really. Not until now, standing at the edge of the grass with his mother's body rigid beside him, and the scent of smoke curling through the trees. A twig snapped somewhere to the left. Freya's ears swiveled instantly. She let out a low sound, barely audible, a warning meant only for her pups. "Get down." Kale dropped instinctively, his belly pressing into the cool earth, his siblings following a heartbeat later. They had done this 100 times in play, hiding from each other in games of pounce and chase. This did not feel like play. Through the grass, Kale caught his first glimpse of them. Two figures moved along the ridge, tall and strange, walking on two legs with an easy confidence that unsettled him more than any predator's stride ever could. They carried long shapes in their hands, dark and smooth, catching the afternoon light. Kale did not know what those shapes were. He only knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep and ancient inside him, that he did not want to find out. The figures paused near a cluster of rocks, speaking to each other in soft, clipped sounds. Kale could not understand their words, but he understood their posture. They were searching for something, and a terrible thought crept into his young mind. What if that something was them? Freya's body tensed further. She glanced back at her pups, and in her eyes Kale saw something he had never seen before. Not fear, exactly, something closer to calculation. She was thinking, planning, weighing paths of escape the way she always did before a hunt, except this time, they were not the hunters. Slowly, carefully, she began to back away from the grass line, motioning with small movements of her head for her pups to follow. Bram went first, his small paws silent on the soft ground. Ivy followed, pressed so close to their mother's side that she nearly tripped over her own feet. Kale came last, glancing over his shoulder one final time at the ridge, at the two figures who had not yet noticed them, who were still scanning the horizon for something they had not yet found. They made it perhaps 30 steps before the wind shifted. It was such a small thing, a simple change in the direction of the breeze, but it carried their scent straight toward the ridge. Kale saw one of the figures go still, saw its head turn, saw it raise an arm and point directly toward them. Freya did not hesitate. "Run!" she said, and this time there was no attempt at quiet. Her voice cracked through the stillness of the forest like a whip. Kale's legs moved before his mind had even processed the command, propelling him forward through the brush, branches snapping against his face, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Behind him, he heard the sharp clipped sounds of the two figures calling to each other, heard the crunch of boots against dry leaves, heard something that made his blood run cold, a loud crack that split the air like the sky itself had broken. He did not know what it was. He only knew that Ivy, running just ahead of him, let out a sharp yelp and stumbled. Kale's whole body screamed at him to keep running, to follow his mother's lead, to save himself. But something stronger than fear rose up inside him in that moment, something he would spend years trying to understand. He swerved, doubling back toward his sister, nudging her flank with his nose, urging her back onto her feet. She had not been hurt, only startled, the sound alone nearly enough to stop her heart. Together they ran, faster now, weaving through the trees in a path that felt less like escape and more like pure animal instinct, taking over every part of him. They ran until the sounds of the two figures faded behind them, until the forest grew thick and tangled and unfamiliar, until Freya finally slowed near a shallow stream, her sides heaving, her eyes scanning every shadow for a threat that might still be following. For a long moment, none of them moved, none of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle trickle of water over stone and the ragged breathing of four wolves who had just learned, in the span of a few terrifying minutes, that the world was far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. Kale pressed his body against his mother's side, seeking the comfort that had always calmed him as a small pup. But even her warmth could not chase away the cold feeling settling in his chest. He thought of the sharp crack that had echoed through the trees, the one that made Ivy stumble. He thought of the two figures on the ridge, tall and strange, carrying things he did not understand but instinctively feared. That night, the pack did not return to their den beneath the fallen pine. Freya led them instead to a hidden hollow deeper in the forest, a place she had used once before, years earlier, during a harsh winter when danger had come in the form of a rival pack. She curled her body around her three pups, and for the first time in his young life, Kale saw genuine worry etched into his mother's face. "They will come back," she said quietly, more to herself than to her pups. "They always come back." Kale did not sleep that night. He lay awake in the darkness, listening to every rustle of leaves, every distant call of an owl, every small sound that might mean danger was near. And somewhere in that long, sleepless night, something shifted inside him. The carefree pup who had spent his days chasing butterflies and wrestling with his siblings began to disappear, replaced by something new, something more alert, more cautious. The next few days passed in a strange, tense quiet. Freya kept her pups close, teaching them things she had never needed to teach them before: how to move without making a sound, how to read the wind for scents that did not belong, how to recognize the particular crunch of a human boot against different types of ground, a sound entirely different from the soft pad of any forest creature. Kale absorbed every lesson like a sponge, driven by a fear he had never known before, and something else too, a determination that surprised even him. He did not want to simply survive the next encounter with the two-legged creatures. He wanted to understand them. He wanted to know why they had come, what they wanted, and whether the forest, his forest, the only home he had ever known, would still be standing by the time he was old enough to lead a pack of his own. On the fourth night after the encounter, Freya gathered her pups beneath a canopy of stars and told them a story she had never shared before. It was about her own mother, and her mother before her, and a time long ago when the forest had stretched even further than it did now, unbroken by roads or fences or the strange wooden structures the humans built. She spoke of a great migration, decades past, when an entire pack had been forced to leave their ancestral territory because the humans had claimed it for themselves. "They do not always mean us harm," Freya explained, her voice soft but firm. "But they do not always understand us either. And when two creatures do not understand each other, fear often speaks louder than reason." Kale turned this thought over in his mind for a long time after the story ended. He thought about the sharp crack in the forest, the one that still echoed in his ears whenever the wind blew a certain way. He thought about the two figures on the ridge, their strange upright walk, their long dark tools. Had they meant to hurt Ivy? Or had fear made them act before they understood what they were truly facing? He did not have an answer. He was too young, too inexperienced in the ways of the world beyond his own forest, to fully grasp the complicated relationship between his kind and the humans who were slowly reshaping the land around them. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. Over the following weeks, the pack settled into a new rhythm, one built around caution rather than curiosity. Freya led hunts further from the ridge, where they had encountered the humans, deeper into the untouched heart of the forest, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. Kale grew stronger during this time, his legs filling out with muscle, his senses sharpening with each passing day. He learned to track prey with a precision that impressed even his mother, and he learned, too, to always keep one ear turned toward the direction of danger, even in moments of calm. But the forest was changing, slowly and steadily, in ways that could not be ignored forever. Kale began to notice new sounds drifting through the trees on quiet mornings, the distant hum of engines, the occasional bark of a dog that was not one of their own kind. Sometimes, if he climbed to a high ridge and looked out across the valley, he could see thin trails of smoke rising from clusters of wooden structures that had not existed the previous season. The humans were not going away. If anything, they were coming closer. One evening, as the pack rested near a quiet clearing, Bram voiced the question that had been sitting unspoken in all their minds. What happens when they reach us? What happens when there is nowhere left to run? Freya did not answer right away. She looked toward the horizon, toward the distant smoke curling into the evening sky, and for a long moment her expression was unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice carrying a weight that Kale would remember for the rest of his life. "Then we stop running," she said, "and we decide who we are willing to become to protect what is ours." The words settled over the pack like a heavy blanket, comforting in their honesty, but frightening in their implication. Kale did not know, in that moment, that his mother's words were more prophecy than comfort. He did not know that within the season, he would be forced to make a choice that would define the rest of his life, a choice between the safety of retreat and the fierce, desperate courage required to stand and fight for everything he loved. But that night, curled beside his siblings beneath a sky full of quiet stars, he allowed himself one last moment of innocence. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the forest, his forest, wash over him one final time before everything changed forever. Somewhere in the distance, an engine rumbled to life, and Kale, still young enough to hope, told himself it was simply the wind. He was wrong. And deep down, in the part of him that had grown up faster than it should have in the past few days, he already knew it. The engine sound did not fade with the wind. It grew louder, closer, until it was joined by others, a chorus of low mechanical growls that rolled through the valley like an approaching storm. Kale sat up in the darkness, his ears pressed flat against his skull, his whole body rigid with alertness. Beside him, Bram and Ivy stirred, waking to the same unfamiliar sound that had pulled Kale from his half-sleep. Freya was already on her feet, standing at the edge of their hollow, staring toward the ridge where the smoke had been rising for weeks. "Something is different tonight," she said quietly, and there was an edge to her voice that Kale had never heard before, not even during their first encounter with the humans. He crept up beside her and looked out across the valley. In the darkness, he could see small points of light moving along the far ridge, bobbing and swaying like fireflies, except these lights moved with purpose, in straight lines, following paths that no firefly would ever take, and beneath the lights, large shapes crawled slowly across the land, their engines growling with every movement. "They are cutting the trees," Freya murmured, "not just walking through them anymore. They are taking them down." Kale did not fully understand what that meant, not at first, but he understood the fear in his mother's voice, and that fear settled into his own chest like a stone. He thought of the fallen pine that had sheltered their old den, of the tall oaks where he had learned to climb as a small pup, of the endless canopy that had always felt like the one unshakable truth of his world. What would happen to all of it, if the humans truly meant to take the trees down one by one? Over the following days, the pack watched from a careful distance as their fears became reality. Massive machines rolled into the forest, their metal arms tearing through trunks that had stood for 100 years in the span of a few short minutes. Where there had once been thick, shaded woodland, there was now open, exposed ground, scarred with deep ruts and piles of fallen timber. The animals that had lived in that part of the forest, the deer, the rabbits, the smaller creatures that made up so much of the pack's diet, fled deeper into the remaining trees, crowding into territory that had never been meant to hold so many mouths. Freya called a meeting one evening with two other wolves from a neighboring family group, an older male named Garrick and his mate, Wren, who had lived in the eastern part of the forest for as long as Freya could remember. They gathered at a quiet clearing, away from the pups, though Kale crept close enough to listen, hidden behind a fallen log, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce curiosity. Garrick's voice was heavy with worry. "They have taken the eastern ridge completely," he said. "Our den is gone. We have been forced to move twice in the past 10 days. Freya's ears drooped slightly at the news. "And the deer?" "Scattering," Wren answered. "Fewer of them each week. The humans are not just taking the trees. They are taking everything the trees supported." Kale listened, as the three adults debated their options, long into the night. Some suggested moving the packs further west, deeper into the mountains where the humans had not yet ventured. Others argued that retreating would only delay the inevitable, that the humans seemed intent on claiming the entire valley eventually, and that a temporary retreat now would only mean facing the same crisis again in a few seasons. There was another option, one that Garrick raised cautiously, watching Freya's reaction carefully as he spoke it aloud. "Some of the younger wolves in the region," he said, "from other territories further south, have begun taking livestock. Sheep, mostly, sometimes cattle, from the farms the humans have built at the edge of the forest. It is easier than hunting deer that have grown scarce, and it does not require traveling far from den sites." Freya's response was immediate and sharp. "That is a dangerous path," she said. "The humans protect their livestock fiercely. Any wolf caught near their farms invites a response far worse than losing territory." Garrick did not argue the point, but Kale, still listening from behind the log, could sense the weight of desperation in his voice. "We are running out of choices, Freya. The forest cannot feed 2 packs the size we have become, not with this much of it stripped bare." The conversation ended without resolution that night, but the weight of it followed Kale back to the hollow where his siblings waited, curled together for warmth against the cooling autumn air. He did not sleep well. He kept thinking about the deer scattering, about the trees falling one after another, about the impossible choice his mother and the other adults now faced: retreat further into unfamiliar mountains, or risk everything by drawing closer to the humans and their livestock. Over the following 2 weeks, the pack tried to adapt without making that choice at all. They hunted further afield each day, sometimes traveling distances that left the younger pups exhausted by the time they returned to the den. Freya taught Kale and his siblings new hunting techniques, ways to work together as a coordinated unit, rather than relying on the abundance that had once made hunting almost effortless. Kale discovered a natural talent for tracking, able to read the faintest signs left behind by prey: broken twigs, disturbed leaves, the particular pattern of hoofprints in soft earth. But even his growing skill could not fully compensate for the shrinking abundance of the forest. Some nights, the pack went to sleep with empty stomachs, a sensation that Kale had rarely experienced in his short life before the humans arrived. He watched his mother grow thinner, her ribs beginning to show faintly beneath her fur, though she never complained, always making sure her pups ate first, from whatever they managed to catch. It was during one of these lean nights that Kale first understood, truly understood, the impossible position his family had been forced into. He woke in the middle of the night to find his mother gone from the hollow. Panic seized him immediately, and he nudged Bram and Ivy awake, the 3 of them creeping out into the darkness to search for her. They found her at the edge of the forest, standing at the tree line, looking out across a moonlit field toward a cluster of wooden buildings in the distance. Inside a fenced enclosure near the buildings, dozens of pale shapes moved slowly in the darkness. Sheep, huddled together against the night chill, unaware of the eyes watching them from the shadows. Freya did not move. She stood perfectly still, her body tense, her gaze fixed on the fenced animals, and Kale understood, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, exactly what she was considering. He crept up beside her, careful not to startle her, and pressed his body against her side. "We do not have to," he said quietly, though he was not entirely sure if he said it for her benefit or his own. Freya was silent for a long moment before she finally spoke. "No," she agreed, "not yet. But I need you to understand something, Kale. There may come a day when we do have to. And when that day comes, I need you to be ready to do whatever is necessary to protect your brother and sister, even if it terrifies you." Kale did not fully grasp the weight of those words that night, but he would carry them with him for the rest of his life. He looked out at the sheep, so different from the deer he was used to hunting, penned in and dependent on the humans for their safety, and felt a strange mixture of pity and desperate hunger that confused and unsettled him. They returned to the hollow that night, without crossing into the field, but the encounter marked a turning point for the pack. The following morning, Freya called another meeting with Garrick and Wren, and this time, the tone of the conversation had shifted from cautious debate to grim necessity. "We cannot continue as we have been," Garrick said plainly. "Two more pups from the southern packs did not survive the last cold snap. Hunger has become as dangerous to us as the humans themselves." Freya nodded slowly, her expression heavy with the weight of leadership, of decisions that would affect not just herself, but every member of her family. "Then we adapt," she said finally, carefully, quietly. "We take only what we must, and we avoid direct contact with the humans whenever possible. But we cannot let our pups starve while sheep graze within sight of our den." It was decided, in the days that followed, that the packs would begin taking occasional livestock from the furthest edges of human farmland, choosing nights when the moon was dim and the humans were least likely to notice, targeting the animals kept furthest from the main buildings where humans slept. Freya insisted on strict rules, no unnecessary risks, no lingering near human structures, and most importantly, absolute avoidance of any direct confrontation with the humans themselves. Kale was not permitted to join these early expeditions, deemed still too young and inexperienced for the danger involved. He watched from the tree line as his mother and Garrick disappeared into the darkness, his heart pounding with worry, until they returned hours later, successful, carrying enough to feed both packs for several days. For a brief period, this uneasy balance seemed to work. The packs ate better, the pups grew stronger, and though the tension of proximity to human farmland never fully disappeared, it seemed, for a while, that a fragile peace had been found between the wolves' need to survive and the danger of drawing too close to the creatures who had reshaped their forest. But peace, Kale would soon learn, was rarely a permanent state when two very different worlds pressed so closely against each other. The humans, it turned out, had already begun to notice the disappearances from their flocks. And unlike the wolves, who approached the conflict with caution and restraint, the humans' response would come swiftly, and with a force that would change everything Kale thought he understood about his place in the world. One evening, as autumn began to give way to the first cold breath of winter, Freya returned from a scouting trip with news that silenced the entire pack. "Fences," she reported, "new ones, taller and stronger than before, stretching along the entire southern edge of the farmland. And something else, something she had never seen before near human settlements. Strange devices mounted on poles, with lights that swept slowly across the fields throughout the night." "They know," Garrick said grimly, when the news reached him. "They know we have been taking their livestock, and they are preparing to stop us." Freya's eyes met Kale's from across the small gathering, and in that look, Kale saw something that frightened him more than any fence or strange device the humans had built. He saw the quiet acceptance of a mother who understood that the fragile peace they had found was about to end, and that whatever came next would test her family in ways they had never been tested before. That night, for the first time since the encounter on the ridge months earlier, Kale dreamed of the sharp crack that had echoed through the trees, the sound that had made his sister stumble, the sound he had never fully understood, but had never forgotten. In his dream, the sound came again, closer this time, and when he woke, gasping, in the darkness of the hollow, he could not shake the feeling that his dream had been less a memory and more a warning of what was still to come. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a ferocity that stripped the last golden leaves from the trees within days. The cold brought its own challenges, driving what remained of the deer herds into hiding and making every hunt a desperate contest against dwindling daylight and biting wind. The pack's careful arrangement with the farmland grew more strained as hunger deepened, and the humans' new defenses made each expedition riskier than the last. Kale, now nearly a full year old, had grown into his body at last. His legs had lengthened, his chest had broadened, and his coat had thickened into a dense gray that blended almost perfectly with the bare winter branches. Freya had begun including him in hunts beyond the immediate territory of the den, trusting him with responsibilities that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. He still deferred to her judgment in most things, but there was a quiet confidence growing inside him now, forged by a year of hardship that had asked more of him than most young wolves ever faced. It was on a bitter evening, with frost already forming on the exposed ground before the sun had even fully set, that Freya gathered the pack for what would become the most important hunt of Kale's young life. Garrick's group had suffered a loss 2 nights earlier, one of the swift-moving lights on the human fences catching them mid-crossing, forcing a retreat that left them without food for their pups. Wren had come to Freya that morning, her voice trembling with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical, begging for help before her family reached a breaking point. "We cannot refuse them," Freya said to her own pack that evening, gathered close in the fading light. "But we must be smarter than we have ever been. The southern fence line is too dangerous now. We will try the old orchard instead, at the western edge, where the trees still grow close enough to give us cover." The orchard she spoke of belonged to a farm Kale had only seen from a distance, a cluster of buildings nestled at the base of a gentle hill, surrounded by neat rows of fruit trees that had long since dropped their harvest for the season. Beyond the orchard lay a smaller enclosure, used, according to Freya's scouting, for a handful of goats kept separate from the main flock of sheep. Fewer animals meant less attention, and the tree cover would allow the pack to approach without being seen by the sweeping lights that now patrolled the southern fields. They set out just after dusk, moving in a tight formation through the deepening shadows of the forest. Kale walked just behind his mother, with Bram and Ivy trailing close behind him, and Garrick's small family following at the rear. The cold bit at their paws with every step, but none of them slowed, driven forward by the shared understanding that failure tonight meant hunger for every pup in both packs. The orchard came into view just as the last light faded from the sky, its bare branches casting long, twisted shadows across the frost-covered ground. Freya paused at the tree line, her nose lifted to test the wind, her eyes scanning every shadow for signs of danger. For several long minutes, she said nothing, simply watching, waiting, her patience a lesson in itself for the younger wolves observing her. Finally, she turned back to the group. "The goats are near the far fence," she said quietly. "We move in pairs. Garrick, take Wren and circle from the east. I will take Kale through the orchard itself. Bram, Ivy, you stay here with the younger pups from Garrick's family. If anything goes wrong, you run, and you do not stop until you reach the hollow." Kale felt a surge of pride at being chosen to accompany his mother directly, quickly followed by a wave of nervous energy that settled deep in his stomach. This was different from the supervised hunts of the past weeks, different from tracking deer through familiar forest paths. This was the heart of human territory, close enough that he could smell wood smoke drifting from the farmhouse chimney, close enough to hear, faintly, the murmur of voices from inside. He and Freya moved through the orchard with careful, deliberate steps, weaving between the rows of bare trees, staying low, staying silent. The goat enclosure came into view ahead, a simple wooden fence surrounding a small shelter where the animals had gathered against the cold. Kale counted 6 goats, their pale shapes visible even in the dim moonlight, none of them yet aware of the danger approaching from the shadows. Freya signaled for him to wait, positioning herself at a gap in the fence line where the wood had begun to rot and separate. She glanced back at him once, her eyes conveying an entire conversation in a single look: patience, precision, trust. Then she moved forward, slipping through the gap with practiced silence. What happened next unfolded faster than Kale's mind could fully process. A dog, unseen until that exact moment, exploded from the shadow of the farmhouse with a burst of sharp, urgent barking that shattered the night's stillness like breaking glass. The goats scattered instantly, crying out in alarm, their hooves pounding against the frozen ground. And from within the farmhouse, a light flared to life, spilling yellow across the yard, followed almost immediately by the sound of a door being thrown open. Freya, still half inside the enclosure, froze for only a heartbeat before turning back toward the gap in the fence. "Run, Kale," she said, her voice sharp with urgency, and this time there was no hesitation in either of them. But the dog was fast, faster than Kale had expected, closing the distance toward Freya with a speed that left little room for a clean escape. Kale's instincts screamed at him to flee, to follow his mother's own command and put as much distance between himself and the farmhouse as possible. But something else rose up inside him in that moment, something fierce and immediate, and before he fully understood what he was doing, he found himself moving not away from the danger, but directly into it. He intercepted the dog just as it closed the final distance to Freya, his body colliding with the larger animal in a tangle of fur and motion. The dog yelped in surprise, thrown off balance by the unexpected impact, giving Freya the crucial seconds she needed to scramble free of the enclosure. Kale scrambled back as well, putting himself between the dog and his mother's retreating form, his heart hammering so violently he could feel it in his throat. The dog recovered quickly, turning its attention fully onto Kale now, its barking growing more frantic, more insistent, drawing the attention of the figures now emerging from the farmhouse doorway. Kale could see them clearly in the spilled light, two shapes, one carrying something long and dark that made his blood run cold with recognition. The same shape he had seen on the ridge, all those months ago. The same shape that had produced that terrible cracking sound. "Freya," said, her voice was tight with fear, unlike anything she had said before. "We need to go. Now." But the dog stood between Kale and the tree line, blocking the most direct path to safety, and the figures from the farmhouse were closing the distance with alarming speed. Kale's mind raced through every option, every lesson his mother had taught him about evasion, about reading terrain, about never allowing fear to freeze his decision-making in a moment of crisis. He darted to the left, drawing the dog's attention away from the direct path, forcing it to pivot and follow him, rather than continuing toward Freya. It worked, but it also meant Kale found himself further from the tree line, closer to the approaching humans, in a position that his mother would never have chosen for him if there had been any other option. He heard Freya call his name, heard the desperation in her voice, but he did not have time to answer. The dog lunged again, and Kale twisted away just in time, his paws scrabbling against the frozen ground, as he fought to maintain his balance and his distance simultaneously. One of the human figures shouted something, a sharp command, that Kale did not understand, but that carried an unmistakable urgency. The other figure raised the long dark shape in its hands, and Kale, even without understanding the specifics of what he was looking at, understood the danger with every fiber of his instinct. He threw himself sideways, just as the terrible cracking sound split the night air, louder and closer than he had ever heard it before, close enough that he felt the disturbance of it pass just beside him. Fear, pure and absolute, flooded through his entire body, but beneath that fear, something else held steady, a fierce determination that refused to let him simply collapse into panic. He scrambled toward the tree line, in a desperate, weaving path, changing direction unpredictably, the way his mother had taught him during evasion drills, making himself as difficult a target as possible. He reached the shadow of the orchard trees just as a second crack split the air behind him, and this time he felt something graze past his shoulder, close enough to tear a few strands of fur but not close enough to find its mark. He did not stop to consider how close that had truly been. He kept running, weaving between the bare trunks of the orchard, following the scent trail his mother had left in her own desperate flight. He found her waiting at the edge of the forest proper, her body tense, her eyes wide with a terror that Kale had never seen in her before, not even during their very first encounter with the humans. The moment she saw him emerge from the orchard, relief flooded her expression, quickly replaced by fierce, protective anger. "You should have run," she said, her voice shaking as she pressed her body against his, checking him for injury with rapid, urgent motions. "You should have listened to me. I could not let them hurt you," Kale answered, and even as he said it, he understood the truth of his own words more fully than he ever had before. In that single, terrifying moment in the orchard, something fundamental had shifted inside him. He was no longer simply his mother's pup, dependent on her protection. He had become, in that instant of fierce, unthinking action, someone willing to place himself between danger and the family he loved. They did not linger to reflect on the moment. The sounds of pursuit still echoed behind them, the dog's barking growing more distant but not yet silent, and Freya wasted no time leading Kale in a wide circling path back toward the rendezvous point where Bram, Ivy, and Garrick's family waited. They found the group exactly where they had left them, tense with worry, Bram immediately rushing forward to press against Kale's side the moment he came into view. Garrick and Wren emerged from the opposite direction only minutes later, and it quickly became clear that their portion of the raid had gone no better. Garrick's flank bore a shallow graze, still bleeding slightly, though he insisted it looked worse than it truly was. The goats had scattered before either group had managed to secure any of them, and the entire expedition, despite the enormous risk taken, had ended without a single successful catch. They regrouped in silence, moving swiftly back toward the safety of the deeper forest, each wolf lost in their own thoughts about how close the night had come to ending in genuine tragedy. Cale walked close to his mother the entire way, his mind replaying the moment of the cracking sound, the sensation of something passing so close to his shoulder that it had torn away strands of his own fur. He had faced real danger for the first time in his life, danger that could have ended everything in an instant, and he had chosen, without fully thinking it through, to face that danger head-on, rather than retreat to safety. It was not until they reached the hollow, well past midnight, that the full weight of the night's events settled over him. He lay curled beside his siblings, his body exhausted, but his mind racing, unable to find rest, despite the bone-deep tiredness in his limbs. Freya kept watch at the entrance of the hollow for hours after their return, her silhouette outlined against the pale moonlight, and Cale understood, even without words passing between them, that his mother was replaying the same terrifying moments in her own mind, wondering how differently the night might have ended. In the days that followed, word of the failed raid spread quickly among the wolves of the region. The humans, it seemed, had grown tired of their livestock disappearing, and the increased vigilance at the orchard farm was quickly replicated at neighboring properties as well. New fences appeared, new lights swept the fields each night, and the wolves, faced with an enemy that adapted just as quickly as they did, found themselves confronting a difficult and uncomfortable truth. The forest that had once been theirs entirely was shrinking not just in physical size, but in the safety it could offer against a species determined to protect what it now considered its own. Cale, in the weeks that followed the raid on the orchard, found himself changed in ways both subtle and profound. He no longer flinched at unfamiliar sounds the way he once had, having faced the very worst the humans could offer and survived it. But he also carried a new weight inside him, an awareness of mortality, of the fragile line between bravery and tragedy, that no wolf his age should have needed to understand so completely. He had run toward danger to protect his mother, and in doing so, he had discovered a courage he had not known he possessed, but he had also discovered, in that single terrifying crack that tore fur from his shoulder, just how close courage could come to costing him everything. That knowledge would follow him for the rest of his life, shaping every decision he made from that night forward, in ways he could not yet fully comprehend, as he lay in the darkness of the hollow, listening to his mother's steady breathing beside him, grateful beyond words that they had both survived to see another dawn. Spring came slowly that year, reluctant to push back the lingering grip of winter, and with its late arrival came a season of uneasy quiet that Cale would later recognize as the calm before the greatest loss his young life had yet endured. The failed raid on the orchard had left both packs more cautious, more careful in their approach to the shrinking boundaries between forest and farmland, but caution alone could not fill empty stomachs indefinitely, and the pressure to find reliable food sources had not eased with the changing season. Freya had grown thinner over the winter months, though she hid it well beneath her thick coat, always ensuring her pups ate before she allowed herself even a small share of whatever the pack managed to catch. Cale noticed anyway, the way her ribs had become more pronounced beneath her fur, the way her movements, while still confident, had lost some of the effortless grace he remembered from his earliest memories of her. He said nothing of it directly, but he began taking on a larger share of the hunting responsibilities himself, determined to ease whatever burden he could from his mother's shoulders. By early spring, Cale had grown into an accomplished hunter in his own right, capable of tracking and bringing down prey with a skill that rivaled wolves twice his age. Freya began to speak, in quiet moments, of the day he might lead a pack of his own, words that filled Cale with a mixture of pride and quiet apprehension. He was not yet ready, he told himself, to carry the kind of weight his mother had carried for so long, the constant vigilance, the endless calculations of risk and survival that came with responsibility for an entire family. It was Garrick who first brought news of the new development that would ultimately upend everything the packs had worked to establish over the difficult winter months. He arrived at Freya's territory one gray morning, his expression grim in a way that immediately set Kale's instincts on edge. "They have brought in hunters," Garrick said without preamble, once the pack had gathered to hear him. "Men with dogs specifically trained to track wolves. They began 3 days ago, working their way through the eastern forest." Freya's expression darkened. "For what purpose?" "To end the raids on the livestock, permanently," Garrick answered. "They believe if enough of us are driven off or eliminated, the ones who remain will be too frightened to approach the farms again." The news spread through the pack like a cold wind, settling into every conversation, every decision made in the days that followed. Freya immediately ordered a shift in their patterns, moving the den site further from any known human trail, increasing the frequency of scouting missions to track the movement of the hunting parties Garrick had described. Kale found himself thrust into a role he had never anticipated so soon, accompanying his mother on these scouting trips, learning to read the signs of human presence with the same precision he had once applied only to tracking prey. For nearly 2 weeks, the careful vigilance seemed to work. The pack avoided direct contact, staying deep within the remaining forest cover, retreating whenever scouts reported hunting parties drawing too close to their territory. But the forest itself continued to shrink under the relentless progress of human expansion, and with each passing week, the safe distance the pack could maintain from human activity grew smaller and smaller. It happened on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, the kind of ordinary day that Kale would later replay countless times in his memory, searching for some sign, some warning he might have missed, that could have changed everything that followed. The pack had split into 2 hunting groups that morning, a common practice during the lean early spring months when prey remained scarce, and covering more ground increased their chances of a successful hunt. Freya led one group, consisting of herself, Kale, and Ivy, while Bram had joined a second group, led by an older, experienced hunter from Garrick's family, tasked with searching territory further to the north. Freya's group had tracked a small herd of deer for several hours, moving carefully through terrain that grew increasingly unfamiliar as they pushed further from their usual hunting grounds. They were close, closer than they had been in days, the scent of the herd strong and fresh on the cool spring air, when the first sound reached them, a distant, sharp bark that was unmistakably not the call of any wild creature. Freya froze instantly, her entire body going rigid with alarm. "Hunting dogs," she said quietly, and Kale felt his own heart rate spike in response to the tension in her voice. Not the farm dogs they had encountered before, but something different, something more organized, more purposeful in its approach. They retreated immediately, abandoning the deer trail without hesitation, moving in the direction that would carry them furthest from the sound of the dogs. But the barking grew louder rather than fading, joined soon by voices, multiple voices, calling to each other in the clipped, urgent tones that Kale had come to associate with danger. The hunting party, whoever they were, seemed to be closing in from multiple directions at once, as though they had somehow anticipated exactly where the wolves would attempt to flee. Freya led them in a series of sharp turns, doubling back, changing direction unpredictably in an attempt to shake whatever trail the dogs had picked up. But the dogs, Kale soon realized with mounting horror, were not tracking by scent alone, or if they were remarkably skilled at maintaining pursuit, despite every evasive maneuver Freya attempted. The distance between the pack and their pursuers continued to close, inch by terrible inch, until Kale could hear not just the barking of the dogs, but the crash of their bodies through underbrush, close enough now that panic threatened to overwhelm his careful training. They broke into a small clearing, and it was there that everything went wrong in a way that would haunt Kale for the rest of his life. 2 hunting dogs emerged from the tree line, just as the pack reached the clearing's edge, cutting off their intended escape route and forcing a split-second decision that offered no good options. Freya, without hesitation, turned to face the dogs directly, positioning her body between the danger and her 2 remaining pups. "Run!" she commanded, her voice carrying an absolute authority that left no room for argument. "Both of you! Now!" Kale hesitated, torn between the instinct to obey his mother's command and the fierce, protective urge that had driven him to intercept the dog at the orchard months earlier. But Ivy was already moving, pulling at his side with desperate urgency, and the weight of responsibility for his sister's safety finally overcame his hesitation. He turned and ran, following Ivy through a gap in the trees, leaving his mother alone to face the two dogs and whatever human hunters were closing in behind them. He would never forgive himself for that decision, even years later, even after understanding on a rational level that there had been no better choice available to him in that terrible, fractured moment. They had not gone more than 100 yards when the sound reached them, sharp and terrible, the same cracking sound Cale had heard at the orchard, except this time, there was no doubt about its target, no uncertainty about what it meant. He stopped running instantly, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to return to the clearing where he had left his mother facing danger alone. Ivy grabbed at his side, her own eyes wide with terror. "She told us to run," she said, her voice breaking. "Cale, she told us to keep running." But Cale could not make his legs carry him further from the clearing. He stood frozen at the edge of the trees, listening for any sound that might tell him what had happened, any indication that his mother had somehow survived whatever had just occurred. The forest had gone eerily quiet, the barking of the dogs replaced by human voices, calmer now, no longer urgent, speaking in tones that carried a finality Cale did not want to understand. He did not go back that day. Ivy, through sheer desperate strength, pulled him further into the forest, both of them running until their legs gave out beneath them, until they collapsed in exhausted, terrified heaps beneath the cover of a fallen tree, waiting through the long hours of afternoon and into evening for any sign of their mother, any indication that she had somehow found her way back to them. She never came. It was Garrick who found them the next morning, drawn by their scent trail after Bram's hunting group had returned to the den and raised the alarm over the missing family members. He confirmed, in the gentlest way he could manage, what Cale had already known in his heart, since the terrible sound had echoed through the forest the previous afternoon. Freya had not survived the encounter. The hunters, satisfied with their success, had moved on, leaving behind a silence in the forest that felt, to Cale, like the ending of everything he had ever understood about safety, about family, about the world itself. The days that followed passed in a haze of grief that Cale struggled to fully process. Bram, Ivy, and Cale found themselves suddenly without the guidance that had shaped every aspect of their young lives, forced to navigate a forest that had grown infinitely more dangerous without their mother's careful wisdom to guide them. Garrick and Wren took the three young wolves under their protection, merging the remaining members of both families into a single, smaller pack, but the loss of Freya left a wound that no amount of communal support could fully heal. Cale replayed the final moments in the clearing endlessly, questioning every decision, wondering whether a different choice, staying to fight alongside his mother rather than fleeing with Ivy, might have changed the outcome. He knew on some level that such thinking served no purpose, that his mother's final command had been given with the clear intention of saving her remaining pups, that her sacrifice had been deliberate and purposeful. But knowledge and grief did not always align neatly, and Cale found himself carrying a weight of guilt alongside his sorrow that would take a very long time to ease. The confident, protective courage he had discovered at the orchard months earlier, the fierce willingness to place himself between danger and his family, felt tainted now, complicated by the knowledge that his mother had made that same choice in the clearing, and it had cost her everything. He began to understand, in the weeks that followed her loss, that bravery was not a simple, uncomplicated virtue. It carried weight, consequence, the possibility of a cost that could never be repaid. Garrick, sensing the burden his young charge carried, spoke with Cale one evening as the pack settled into their new, combined territory. "Your mother did not die because she was foolish," he said carefully. "She died because she chose to protect you, and that choice, however painful its outcome, was made from love, not recklessness. Do not let her sacrifice become a reason to fear your own courage." Cale listened to Garrick's words, turning them over slowly in a mind still raw with loss, and though he could not yet fully absorb their meaning, he sensed, somewhere deep beneath the grief, the beginning of a truth he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. Courage and loss, it seemed, were not opposites but companions, walking hand in hand through every difficult choice a creature might face, in a world that offered no guarantees, no certainties, only the fierce, uncertain hope that love might be worth whatever price it demanded. That spring, As the forest slowly began to bloom again around a pack forever changed by its losses, Kale made a quiet, private vow to himself, one he would carry through every challenge still to come. He would honor his mother's sacrifice, not by abandoning the courage she had shown in her final moments, but by carrying it forward, tempered now by a hard-won understanding of its true cost, an understanding that would shape every decision of the difficult years still ahead of him. Years passed, and the forest that Kale had known as a pup continued its slow, inevitable transformation. Roads cut deeper into territory that had once seemed endless. New farms appeared where dense woodland had stood for generations. And the wolves who remained, Kale among them, learned to survive within an ever-shrinking world, adapting their habits, their hunting grounds, their very understanding of safety to fit the narrowing boundaries the humans allowed them. Kale grew into the leader his mother had once predicted he would become, taking on the responsibility of guiding the combined pack after Garrick, grown old and increasingly weary, stepped back from the burdens of leadership. Bram and Ivy remained close throughout the years, though Ivy eventually left to form a family of her own further north, in territory still relatively untouched by human expansion. Bram stayed by Kale's side, the two brothers sharing an unspoken bond forged in the loss they had endured together on that terrible spring afternoon so many years earlier. Kale never forgot the sound that had taken his mother from him. It lived somewhere deep inside him, a permanent resident of memory that surfaced whenever the wind carried an unfamiliar scent, whenever a distant sound echoed with the sharp crack that still, even after all these years, made his entire body tense with instinctive alarm. He had faced that same danger many times since, had led his own pack through encounters with hunters, with fences, with the slow, relentless creep of human settlement into what remained of the wild forest. Each time he drew on the lessons his mother had taught him, the careful balance of courage and caution that had allowed him to survive where others had not. But something had changed in him since that day in the clearing, something he recognized clearly now, with the wisdom that only years and loss could provide. The fearless, almost reckless bravery he had shown at the orchard, throwing himself between the dog and his mother without a moment's hesitation, had been the courage of youth, unclouded by any true understanding of consequence. That version of courage, he now understood, could only exist once, in that brief window before loss taught its harder lessons. Every act of bravery since then had carried the weight of that knowledge, the awareness that courage always came with a price, that protecting those he loved might, someday, cost him everything, just as it had cost his mother. He had continued to act with courage throughout the years, had faced down threats to his pack with a steady, deliberate resolve that Garrick himself had once praised as wisdom beyond his years. But it was a different kind of courage now, weighted, careful, aware of its own cost in a way that the fearless young pup at the orchard could never have understood. On a quiet evening many years later, as an older Kale rested at the edge of a familiar clearing, watching his own grown pups practice their hunting skills in the fading light, he found himself thinking back to that single, fearless moment of his youth, the moment he had intercepted the farm dog without a second thought, driven purely by instinct and love, uncomplicated by any true understanding of the danger he faced. He realized, in that quiet reflection, that this had been the last moment he had ever felt truly, uncomplicatedly brave. Every act of courage since had been shadowed by the knowledge his mother's loss had taught him, by an awareness of consequence that no amount of experience could ever fully erase. He had grown wiser, stronger, more capable of protecting those he loved. But the pure, fearless bravery of that single moment at the orchard, before he understood what courage might truly cost, remained a memory he cherished and mourned in equal measure. His mate, a steady and thoughtful wolf named Ellen, who had joined his pack several seasons after his mother's loss, settled beside him as the evening deepened into night. She had heard the story of his mother many times over the years, had listened patiently as Kale worked through the complicated grief and gratitude that memory still stirred within him. "You still think of her," Ellen said quietly, not a question but a gentle acknowledgement. "Every day," Kale answered, "though it grows easier to remember the good, alongside the pain." He watched his pups continue their play in the clearing below, their movements still clumsy, still innocent of the true dangers that awaited them, as they grew older. He thought of his own mother, watching him with that same protective love so many years ago, teaching him the careful lessons that would eventually allow him to survive in a world that had grown increasingly hostile to creatures of the wild. The forest around them had changed almost beyond recognition since his own childhood, the boundaries of human territory pressing ever closer, the wild spaces shrinking year by year in a slow, relentless tide that showed no sign of reversing. Kale had learned to lead his pack through this changing world, with a hard-won wisdom, teaching his own pups the same careful balance of courage and caution his mother had once taught him, hoping desperately that the lessons would be enough to see them safely through whatever challenges still lay ahead. But he never taught them, could never quite bring himself to teach them, about that final, fearless moment at the orchard, the moment before understanding, before loss, when courage had felt simple and pure and entirely without cost. That memory belonged only to him, a private treasure carried quietly through every difficult year that had followed, a reminder of a version of himself that could never exist again, not truly, not once the weight of consequence had settled so permanently into his heart. As the last light faded from the sky above the clearing, Kale rose slowly to gather his pups for the night, his movements carrying the quiet confidence of a leader who had survived, who had learned, who had carried his mother's sacrifice forward into a lifetime of careful, deliberate courage. He would continue to protect his family with everything he had, for as long as the forest allowed him to draw breath. But somewhere, in the quiet corners of memory that only came alive in moments of stillness like this one, he would always carry that single, fearless afternoon at the orchard, the last time he had ever felt brave, without also feeling the weight of everything that bravery might cost. It was, he had come to understand, the truest gift his mother had ever given him, not just her final sacrifice in the clearing, but the earlier lesson too, the one she had never spoken aloud, but had shown him through every careful, protective choice she made throughout his childhood. Courage was not about the absence of fear or consequence. It was about choosing, again and again, despite fully understanding the cost, to stand between danger and the ones you loved. And though he would never again feel the simple, fearless bravery of that first battle against the humans, Kale carried something far more enduring in its place, a courage tempered by loss, deepened by understanding, and strengthened by a love that had survived every hardship the changing world had placed before it. In the end, he realized, watching his pups settle into sleep beside him beneath a sky full of familiar stars, that was a far greater inheritance than fearlessness could ever have been. The forest around them continued its quiet transformation, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the lights of human settlement glowed steadily against the darkening sky. But within the clearing, for one more peaceful night, an old wolf watched over his family, with the same fierce, complicated love his own mother had once shown him, carrying her memory forward into a future she would never see, but had shaped, in every meaningful way, all the same.